Welcome to episode 98 of Lucretius Today. This is a podcast dedicated to the poet Lucretius, who wrote On the Nature of Things, the only complete presentation of Epicurean philosophy left to us from the ancient world. I'm your host Cassius, and together with our panelists from the EpicureanFriends.com forum, we'll walk you through the 6 books of Lucretius's poem, and we'll discuss how Epicurean philosophy can apply to you today. We encourage you to study Epicurus for yourself, and we suggest the best place to start is the book Epicurus and His Philosophy by Canadian professor Norman DeWitt. If you find the Epicurean worldview attractive, we invite you to join us in the study of Epicurus at EpicureanFriends.com, where you'll find a discussion thread for each of our podcast episodes and many other topics. At this point in our podcast, we've completed our first line-by-line review of Lucretius's poem, and we've turned to the presentation of Epicurean ethics found in Cicero's On Ends. Today we'll continue with that material and focus on justice, starting with line 50. Now let's join Martin reading today's text.
Justice is left to complete our statement concerning the whole of virtue, but considerations nearly similar may be urged. Just as I have proved wisdom, temperance, and courage to be linked with pleasure, so that they cannot possibly by any means be sundered or severed from it, so we must deem of justice, which not only never injures any person, but on the contrary always produces some benefit, not solely by reason on its own power and constitution, whereby it calms our minds, but also by inspiring hopes that we shall lack none of the objects which nature, when uncorrupted, craves. And as recklessness and caprice and cowardice always torture the mind and always bring unrest and tumult, so if wickedness has established itself in a man's mind, the mere fact of its presence causes tumult. If moreover it has carried out any deed, however secretly it may have acted, yet it will never feel a trust that the action will always remain concealed. In most cases the acts of wicked men are at first dogged by suspicion, then by talk and rumor, then by the prosecutor, then by the judge. Many have actually informed against themselves, as in your own consulship. But if there are any who seem to themselves to be sufficiently barricaded and fortified against all privity on the part of their fellow men, still they tremble before the privity of the gods, and imagine that the very care by which their minds are devoured, night and day are imposed upon them, with a view to their punishment by the eternal gods. Again, from wicked acts what new influence can accrue, tending to the diminution of annoyances, equal to that which tends to their increase, not only from consciousness of the actions themselves, but also from legal penalties and the hatred of the community. And yet some men exhibit no moderation in money-making, or office, or military command, or wantonness or gluttony, or the remaining passions which are not lessened but rather intensified by the trophies of wickedness, so that such persons seem fit to be repressed rather than to be taught their error.
Last week, Martin read lines 50 through 54 of the Torquatus section of Book 1 of Cicero's Own Ends. And having heard that again, we're going to discuss those paragraphs and also wrap in the principal doctrines and Vatican sayings, which are also relevant to justice. So with that as background, we have with us today both Joshua and Martin. Charles is out this week. But turning to paragraph 50, justice is introduced here. It's still left to complete our statement of the whole of virtue, but the same considerations that have applied to the prior virtues, he says, are also going to apply to justice. And the main one is that just as wisdom, temperance, and courage are linked with pleasure, so we deem that of justice as well, which doesn't injure any person, but on the contrary, always produces some benefit. Why don't we start by talking about that general consideration? What are the common denominators that we've seen Torquatus make so far? That they're instrumental towards the goal of pleasure, I think, is the ultimate point that we're discussing. But I think there's probably some other points as well. And one of them I want to be sure to talk about is an issue that I think about a lot, which is if these virtues are not absolute, if there's not a list of them somewhere in heaven or in a list of ideal forms like Plato would suggest, what are they? Are they something that we as humans just label according to categories we think are appropriate? Or do they have any existence of their own that justifies our labeling them like we do? Does that make any sense at all as an opening question? Can you bring it to reality, Joshua?
Okay, yeah, you make an excellent point here, Cassius, because we've been talking about virtues now for a couple of weeks, and we seem to keep butting up against the same problem, which is these virtues seem to have these undefinable qualities. And we really can't even agree on whether we agree that they are virtuous. We can't really agree on what temperance means, for example, or whether we should be temperate. Wisdom is another example. We can't really agree on how do you even define wisdom, or what makes a person wise. Courage might seem to be a little more obvious. But today we're going to be talking about justice. And justice, of all the virtues we talk about, this one seems to me to be the one that has the most obvious importance to every person who's going to be listening to this. Because everybody wants justice, at least for themselves, for the society they live in. Everybody wants to be treated fairly, if that's what we decide that the word means. Everybody wants to do the right thing. That brings in an ethical component to justice. But today we're going to try to answer the question of what is justice? How does it link to Epicurean philosophy? And how does justice, like these other virtues, turn out to be just one more road to the ultimate goal, which is pleasure?
Great way of saying it.
Yes. Okay, so the considerations that may be urged concerning the whole of virtue, as it regards all of the virtues, wisdom, temperance, courage, and now justice, as we've been talking about for the last couple of weeks, we've been trying to figure out if these virtues are not goals in themselves, and Epicurean philosophy certainly rejects the position that virtue is an end in itself. If these are not ends in themselves, then how can we use them on our personal path to our goal, which is pleasure, right?
Yeah, and I would even ask you this, Joshua, even after you've stated it the way you did, can we even know whether a thing is wise or just or courageous or temperate? Can we even recognize those characteristics without knowing the result of them, if my question makes any sense? In other words, do we have any way of knowing whether a course of action is wise or not without comparing it to its object and what actually happens as a result of following that course? I think that's a question that bothers me. I don't know that I can recognize wisdom beforehand until I see the result of what has been undertaken in the name of wisdom. Does that question make any sense? And how would you unwind that? And Martin, of course, you feel free to jump in too.
Yeah, no, that's a good question as well. I'm struggling to come up with an answer that doesn't make reference to something else. Whatever, I'll just go into it. Okay, so one of the things that sort of kicked off the American Civil War, right, was John Brown, who was a firebrand abolitionist. And where things came to a head, really, for him, and partially for the nation, was the raid by John Brown and mostly his sons, but also a group of other people, on the government arsenal in Harper's Ferry, Virginia. And as you can imagine, in a place as polarized as it was at that time, the reactions to this were totally mixed, right? Some people thought, oh, this was the most damn fool thing he could have done, right? That there was no wisdom in it. Whatever courage there was in it was totally marred by how badly he had screwed up doing it. Some people thought that this was sort of the pinnacle of human courage, and he had taken a stand not only for himself and for his person, but he had taken a stand really for a whole nation. So the question you raise is an important one. What bothers me here is we're coming into the question of justice. And when it comes to the question of justice, it's hard to see how justice, not just as a virtue, but as sort of an institution, how it works if we don't know ahead of time whether it is just or unjust. God, I'm really struggling with that one.
As we were preparing for this episode, we started talking about the fact that we would want to incorporate some of the principal doctrines and Vatican sayings as well. And I believe those are even more clear than the section that we've just read in Torquatus, in making the point that there's no such thing as absolute justice. Principal doctrine number 33, justice is never anything in itself, but in the dealings of men with one another, in any place, whatever, at any time. It's a kind of compact not to harm or be harmed. In Epicurean philosophy discussions, it seems like we really bring out these doctrines in the 30s series because they're so challenging to us. But continuing on at Doctrine 34, injustice is not an evil in itself, but only in consequence of the fear which attaches to the apprehension of being unable to escape those appointed to punish such actions. So, Joshua, what you've properly introduced for the beginning, I think, of this discussion is that justice is a really gut-wrenching issue for people to think about and feel about. I was going to say today, but I'm sure throughout human history, it's the same question. Everybody comes to the topic with their own predispositions and their own views of what is just and unjust. Really, the word feeling, I think, is particularly appropriate in discussing justice because you feel something to be just and unjust. You can't really discuss justice dispassionately even. You can maybe discuss wisdom dispassionately or temperance. Oh my gosh, temperance is nothing but dispassionately. But justice just reeks of taking a stand and having a position and righteously defending that position. Before I forget to say this, to display my trivia knowledge of old movies, there's the Ronald Reagan movie, Santa Fe Trail, which is the story of the John Brown raid at Harper's Ferry. Have you seen that movie by chance, Joshua?
No, I haven't.
And everybody loves to make Ronald Reagan jokes about how poor an actor he was. It was actually an Errol Flynn movie as opposed to a Ronald Reagan movie. Ronald Reagan played one of the Union officers. But I highly recommend the Santa Fe Trail. The person who played John Brown was a character actor by the name of Raymond Massey. He just reeks of I guess the word is gravitas. When you watch that movie and see Raymond Massey portray John Brown, it's obvious that you either believe that he is a Jesus figure, just a Moses figure. He just embodies the righteousness of the goal of eliminating slavery. And at the same time, people who would see another perspective in that character will see just an absolutely radical, if not even unhinged type of personality. One of the Latin phrases in justice is, let justice be done though the heavens fall asunder, or something like that. When you get so passionately devoted to the justice of your cause, it doesn't matter how many people get killed or how much destruction takes place. It's the old question of whether the ends justify the means or not. Does might make right and things like that are very difficult to deal with. Another preliminary comment I wanted to make before we got too far into this discussion was that at EpicureanFriends.com and what I try to do in my Epicurean material is to stay away as much as I personally can from letting my own personal preferences come through in these discussions, and especially as to justice. Not because I don't think you should have these personal dispositions, because I think you must be engaged in the things around you and defend yourself and the principles and the people and the ideas that you believe in. But because the Epicurean philosophy position on this is so challenging that, in my view, if we allow ourselves to get too identified with one particular position, then people will start looking at us as, well, he's a conservative or he's a liberal or he's a socialist or something else, and it undercuts the credibility that somebody might have in presenting the philosophy. As far as I know, Epicurus did not take a position on the American Civil War or the events of the 20th century or communism, capitalism, all those things like that. To some extent, he had some comments on communism because Plato discussed it, but he certainly didn't have the events of the modern world to comment on. And the value of Epicurean philosophy, I think, is to open your eyes to the possibility that all of these perspectives that you've been taught as the common morality throughout your life may be wrong, that you need to evaluate them for yourself. And the way to evaluate them for yourself is to go back to the fundamentals, which is what Epicurus is talking about. And he makes the point that there is no such thing as absolute justice. There's no supernatural God. There's no center of the universe where there's a tablet with justice written on it. And so there's not a universal rule that applies to everyone at all times in all places, no matter how much of a gut-wrenching identification we feel within ourselves. So I've gone on a rant there to discuss what you introduced, Joshua, but the point you've raised, at least in my mind, by bringing up Harper's Ferry and John Brown, that's no doubt a distinctly American way of looking at it, and an episode from American history that is quickly fading into ancient history, and a lot of people in other sections of the world won't even know about. But you can substitute whatever the most gut-wrenching period in history that you'd like to put in that example, because no matter how gut-wrenching it is, there's no God who justifies your position on it, and there's no absolute right or wrong. It's written in the stars, so to speak, that says that you're right and the people who were on the other side of that argument were wrong. So the place to start is to understand that that absence of absolute perspective is there, and that you think about the nature of the universe, and then when you come to that understanding, then you can pursue it in a way that is more intelligent. Joshua or Martin, we're still at the very preliminary stages of talking about the topic, but Martin, do you have preliminary thoughts about how to approach the whole topic of justice? What do you think? Martin, I know that your perspective, a scientist by occupation and by study and so forth, and in the type of work that you do and the type of interest that you have, you do put these issues of passionate commitment to particular positions of justice off to the side, maybe, at least in the day-to-day work of being a scientist or being a technician. But no doubt you have as many deeply held and felt beliefs about justice as anyone else would.
Yeah, I mean, today it's actually somehow made easy, at least superficially. We have a set of laws and other regulations within the legal system, which basically define, in the context of the communities we live in, what is justice. But still, that there are many lawsuits shows that this is not enough to really define justice to the point that it would be obvious to everyone from the beginning.
And in fact, maybe that's one of the premises, is that it's impossible to do that it may not even be a reasonable goal to try to define something that's obvious to everyone that it is just. Is that even a practical goal, that everyone should have the same sense of justice? And Martin, again, I want to use the advantage of your being European and based in Germany and so forth. I know that the Europeans have a much different system of legal procedure. I've always had this understanding that the European court system is less based on juries and more based on judges. I don't know whether that applies to criminal cases or civil cases or everything. But the United States system seems to be based on this view that the best way to get justice is to have a decision made by a jury of your peers, of the local people in a local community, as if that's kind of an institutionalized form of local justice. But I think the European position is different, and you don't have as many juries. Am I right about that understanding?
I mean, there's also an element of having juries, but I don't see them that they're as prominent. Normally, if there's a case reported, the jury is never mentioned. So it seems they are not really that critical as it's sometimes in the United States.
So there's something about the European system of justice that relies more on the use and the position of sort of experts. I guess the judges are supposed to be experts in the law. And of course, maybe there's panels of judges as opposed to just single judges. But there seems to be more a European idea that justice can be dealt with as a matter of science to some degree, as a matter of study by an expert in the field of justice, whereas the American system seems to be the opposite. It seems to be that we don't even let experts make decisions. We insist that the decisions be made by non-experts in justice. Oh boy, and that reminds me of a Thomas Jefferson quote that I use a lot, and I won't try to find it. I'll post it in the show notes, but he was talking about how he believed that justice was better found in, I think he talks about plowmen, farmers basically, rather than in teams of highly educated and trained people. And maybe the direction that I'm talking now is justice a matter of something that can be reduced to a science? Is it something that can be reduced to writing and become a firmly defined thing? Or is it something that always is going to be a feeling in the hearts of the local people who are involved? Is justice something that is ultimately rooted in feeling, or is it something that's ultimately has some way we can define it scientifically?
Okay, so the way I would frame this discussion is that Epicurus's conception of justice actually presents a challenge for a lot of people. In fact, I think I remember this about myself when I was sort of getting into Epicurean philosophy. The idea that you couldn't count on moral absolutes, it's a real challenge for quite a lot of people. You want to believe that there's a way things should be, but Epicurus is saying there's not. There's no way to figure out what that would be. Nobody has, carved these rules into the clouds. But the only way to get at it is for a group of people to come together from time to time in different places and to sort of come up with their own sets of rules, to come up with their own conception of what justice is and what justice means for them. This is very difficult for people who were raised believing that there was absolute justice or absolute morality, or that your enemies would be, punished in another lifetime. God, what a great feeling that must be, to think that your enemies are going to be punished in another lifetime. But they won't be. And you're going to have to find a way to live with that, because justice is precisely what Epicurus conceived of it. He thought it was a convention, something that people came up with from time to time, and that it's going to change over time. It's going to differ from place to place. And learning to live with that can be a real challenge for somebody first coming into the philosophy. The question that you asked earlier, Cassius, which was, can we know ahead of time whether an act is just or unjust? It's interesting because when I look at the law in the country that I'm most familiar with, the United States, there isn't a particular area that's been carved out, I think, as an exception to what I think is the general rule. But you'll have to correct me if I'm wrong here. But when it comes to freedom of expression in particular, there's this concept called prior restraint, which is you can't, it's not possible to know ahead of time whether, how do I want to put this, whether speech can be made into a crime or defined as an action, and the action is a crime, right? So you can't know ahead of time. So people can't. This is an argument against self-censorship, partially, right? I can't say that because I don't know if the secret police are going to scoop me up and put me into a gulag. So this is why the United States, to my knowledge, has the most robust freedom of expression anywhere in the world.
Joshua, another example of what you're talking about, I think, is there's a famous Supreme Court justice who said something about pornography, that he knows it when he sees it, which implies that you don't have the ability really to just define what even something like pornography would be until you see it, until you react to it. And I don't know exactly the ins and outs of the free speech laws and the implications of the prior restraint label that you've just mentioned, but yeah, and in so many areas of the law, including again self-defense, which comes up over and over again, you've always got this issue of, it seems like there's regulations that talk to you about what you can and cannot do. But there's always this escape valve, it seems like, in the law of justification, that if somebody comes at you with a gun or whatever, you're justified in self-defense. And in the American system, that's exactly where they want the juries to make the decision, because they always have this viewpoint that maybe what's been done is ultimately justified by the facts. But to know that ahead of time and to actually include that into some kind of a statute is impossible, which is at the point that you're making.
Yeah, I'm going to give you another example here. This is a concrete example of one person's idea for how we should enact a sense of justice and how we should review it after the fact. So Sam Harris has said on the subject of torture, he said, because people often try to justify torture because of the ticking bomb scenario, right?
Right.
I need to torture this guy now so he can give up the information so I can go save 100,000 people in this football stadium or whatever it happens to be, or on this airplane. Sam Harris's view is torture should always be illegal. It should always be considered an unjust act. And then so that if you do torture someone, you know that you run the risk of yourself being imprisoned for life. But there are cases in which you might run that risk and then feel yourself justified in presenting your case before a jury later on. But for the purposes of having a civilization, we need to agree that right up front, we need to agree that torture should be illegal in all cases, and that the people who are in the position with the ticking bomb, who need to run the risk of doing it, they will operate under the presumption that they are going to be punished for what they're doing. And they have the alternative of presenting it to a jury and maybe being exonerated.
Yeah, see, my response to that would be that you're right, having a law against torture makes a tremendous amount of sense, but that the law also should enshrine justification as well, and that you're talking about it in terms of what would you expect the judge and jury to do with your situation, looking ahead into the future after you came up with your scenario of torture in order to save tremendous numbers of people, looking ahead, what would you want that person in that position to think would happen to them later on? And I guess the twist I would say is that I would expect that person who has to make that decision to think not only that there's a law against torture and he's going to be brought up and examined to see whether he has violated it, but I think I would also want him to think that there's a law in favor of justification, so that the jury or the tribunal that saw his case would have the right to look at the facts and decide if he were in fact justified. Now, that's different probably than what Sam Harris is saying. I hear you telling me, because I've not heard Sam Harris's example, but that's a very interesting question and way to look at everything. Martin, do you have a comment on that scenario in terms of how the law should be written to cover a situation like that?
You know, it's of course best if the law is written in a way that it's clear what is just and what is unjust, so that everybody knows what is the right thing to do and what not. You know? So that is how it should be attempted to do.
Now we're into the issue of hypothetical questions and all the different pitfalls that come into setting up. There's another legal phrase: hard cases make bad law. And the point of all that being that hypotheticals are by nature limited in what you can include within them, and they don't reflect reality, and you can twist yourself into positions that ultimately are rabbit holes by pursuing hypotheticals as if they were reality when they're not. Joshua, where do we go next?
Well, I'm trying to think of a way to get out of these little snippets of historical examples or case law and bring it back to a more...
Yeah, but that's the point. We've had that discussion again on analogies and so forth, but that's the American system of justice, is that we don't have that continental system of writing it all out in a statute, which is kind of what Martin has just said. Martin has just represented the continental system, or what I understand they have in Louisiana, the French system of the Napoleonic Code or the Roman Code, the Code of Justinian, that you try to be as clear as you can in setting out exactly what the law is and exactly what it's not, so that you'll be able to judge your actions accordingly. And surely that is a desirable goal. But the American system seems to be that there are limits to that. And so we have this common law system. And that's where I was commenting on what you said, Joshua, is that's what our legal system is mostly, is going back to particular cases and deciding what happened in those particular cases and analogizing them to the current one. So I'm not trying to take sides between the American system and the European systems of justice, but I do think that as you think about the issues, there really is a kind of a philosophic divide. You have to answer for yourself, how much specificity can the law really have within it? Because again, I think it's clear under the Epicurean view, you cannot have the same law everywhere all the time in all places. And let's go ahead right now and read one of the most wordily worded doctrines of them all, 37 and 38. Might as well try to read them for just a moment. Among the actions which are sanctioned as just by law, that which is proved on examination to be of advantage in the requirements of men's dealings with one another has the guarantee of justice, whether it is the same for all or not. But if a man makes a law and it does not turn out to lead to advantage in men's dealings with each other, then it no longer has the essential nature of justice. And even if the advantage of the matter of justice shifts from one side to the other, but for a while accords with the general concept, it is nonetheless just for that period in the eyes of those who do not confound themselves with empty sounds, but look to the actual facts. Now, I don't know how you could be much more clear, which is that justice is constantly shifting according to the context and according to the circumstances. And as if that wasn't wordy enough, I think 38 says largely the same thing. It just twists and turns further, because 38 says, where, provided the circumstances have not been altered, actions which were considered to have been shown not to accord with the general concept in actual practice, then they are not just. But where, when circumstances have changed, the same actions which were sanctioned as just no longer lead to advantage, They were just at the time when they were of advantage for the dealings of fellow citizens with one another, but subsequently they are no longer just when no longer of advantage. I don't see how you could be more clear as a refutation of the goal of attempting to write a law that is the same for everybody at all times, in all places, in all situations. I think 37 and 38 say you can try that, but as soon as the circumstances change and the results of that law are no longer just, then the law is no longer just. Am I reading that wrong?
Yeah, but Cassius, there's a way to flip that around on the American system as well.
Go ahead.
That if you're trying to maximize, freedom and liberty by not writing a list of things restricting what people can and cannot do. Let's say, for example, you are free to buy as much copper as you want, right? You have that right. That's considered justice in the United States. We don't restrict the sale of copper. Then we go into a great war, and it turns out copper is very important, and we don't have enough of it to go around. We need it for things like putting together electronics on battleships or whatever it happens to be. There's a shortage of copper. So now we're going to step in and tell you, you can no longer buy copper. You've got a ration card. If you don't have a good reason for buying it, you're not allowed to buy it. And then the war ends, and now we're back to the original. You can buy however much you want. I don't know how I'm going to fit that all together here, but
it's a perfect example of what's being discussed here in 37 and 38, I think. But go ahead.
Yeah. Because it's the easy access to copper, for example, is advantageous in men's dealings because everybody gets what they need to, start their business or wire their house or whatever it turns out to be. And then the calculus changes when you get into a war, where suddenly it's no longer advantageous in men's dealings for you to use up all the copper in your business of making HD televisions, because we don't need as many HD televisions as we need microchips or whatever, or copper wire. We need this more than that. And so we're going to change the law, restrict your access to copper, because it's more advantageous to do this other thing for a while. And then the war ends and we go back. And now it's more advantageous to go back to the earlier system. Does that make any sense at all?
It certainly does. But now you introduced that by saying you were going to flip it around on the American system. How does that flip it around on the American viewpoint?
Because here in this case, we don't have, I guess I'm trying to get a handle on, maybe this is getting too much into economics. But you could say the same thing about, for example, the freedom of speech. As I said before, I think the freedom of expression is probably most robust in the United States, partially because of issues like prior restraint and maybe what you were talking about with the common law system. But when you design a system around that, right, because there's no precedent, for example, that's going to tell you, or all the precedent you have was under this context of, the nation's at peace. Well, now we're at war, so the precedent just doesn't seem to apply anymore. I'm floundering here, Cassius.
No, everything I'm hearing you say to me is an illustration of exactly what Epicurus is saying in 37 and 38, that you can have any system of law you want, whether it's economics or whether it's on free speech or whether it's on anything else. You can have any system of statutory regulation that you wish, but it's just only so long as the result is for the actual benefit of the fellow citizens who are involved. And when, because of some change in circumstance, in your illustration, going from war to peace and back again, when those facts change, the existing law is no longer just when the circumstances has shifted. And he seems to really be wanting to pound this point home, because 37 and 38 and 36 even all seem to be aimed at making this point that the justice of a situation turns on its circumstances and on its results, is what I'm reading there. Martin, again, the European context may give you a different perspective, and I'm particularly interested in what you're thinking about 37 and 38 here.
I mean, this would then lead to a situation where it would be good to change the law.
And maybe you end up just talking about the system of government in the sense of whether you have a democracy or a republic or a oligarchy or whatever. I mean, if laws change in virtually any system, whether it's king or anything else, the king changes the law. So it really doesn't necessarily validate one system of government or the other, as long as the law changes to fit the circumstances and the results are for the benefit of the people involved. I don't know that there's even an endorsement of a particular system of government here. It's just the endorsement that the law should change according to the circumstances. But, at the same time that we're talking about this, there's a lot of discussion out there as to, is this the social contract? Let's talk about contract for a while, because, in fact, it is in Principal Doctrine 33, justice is never anything in itself, but in the dealings of men with one another in any place, whatever, and at any time. It is a kind of compact not to harm or be harmed. Joshua, you may be on top of the Greek there better than I am. I don't know what the Greek word for compact is there and whether we're really talking about a contract or whatever. But just talking about Epicurean justice as a contract doesn't necessarily, at least in my mind, by any means end the discussion, because it sounds like the contract or the agreement of the people involved, which could be the law that you're talking about. It seems that what he's saying here is that the compact itself is just only so long as it is for the mutual benefit of both. And as soon as it is no longer for some contextual reason for the benefit of both, it ceases to be just. So the question I want to throw out there is, even though you may call this Epicurean justice a compact, which is in 35, it's not possible for one who acts in secret contravention of the terms of the compact not to harm or be harmed, to be confident he'll escape detection. So clearly there is a view here that Epicurus is talking about justice in the form of a compact or agreement. But does it sound to you like what he's saying, that the compact can be dissolved at any time as soon as one of the people in the compact decides it's no longer for their benefit? Am I reading that right?
Okay.
In other words, breaking a compact does not seem to be unjust if the reason you're breaking it is because it's not for your benefit anymore. That's what I want to wrestle with and try to be clear about, is that I think everybody comes to it with the general understanding that if you have an agreement, it's unjust to break the agreement. I think that would be our presumption. If you give your word and enter an agreement, you should keep it. Breaching a contract is wrong. But I think Epicurus is saying that it's not wrong if the circumstances have changed and it's no longer to your advantage.
Well, and I mean, the whole Declaration of Independence, of course, from an American perspective, there's a line in there where he says that when the government becomes injurious of these rights, it is the right and duty of the people to throw off the government.
Right,
so
right.
You've got, this is a perfect example of the government that we put together or that we were under is no longer advantageous to us. So we're just going to throw that one off and start our own. So
that's your clear link there to your Thomas Jefferson as an Epicurean writing into the Declaration of Independence, Epicurean ideas of, as you're saying, the circumstances have changed. It was just for us to be British subjects while it was to our advantage to be. But when given the change in circumstances, it's now just for us to have a revolution. So he's saying that would be an example of circumstances changing, at least in the eyes of a certain group of people.
Yeah, but there's no sort of objective perspective at any point which you could look at this and say, that's just, or that's just, or that's just. It's all subjective. It's all a group of people coming together to make the rules for themselves, really, isn't it?
That's what it comes down to in my mind, I think, yes, is that in the most basic example you could give, you may have formed a contract with someone else to do some work for you. But even in contract law, I think in the United States, certainly, and probably even anywhere, circumstances can arise in which it is just to break that contract. The law doesn't hold you responsible for following a contract which circumstances have rendered to be oppressive or just impossible to fulfill. Those are two examples, I think, of the justification to get out of a contract.
Well, let me tell you what does make agreeing to a contract impossible in the minds of some people. Because before you had the Declaration of Independence, before you had an American justice system, you had an explorer named Amerigo Vespucci, right? So he came over to the New World. He was an explorer, a cartographer, and he wrote a book in which he describes his encounters with the Native Americans, a certain group of them. I don't remember which group or where, but he says their manner of living could be described as Epicurean.
Oh.
Okay. So he writes this book, or he goes back to Europe, writes this book, publishes it. It's widely read. In fact, it's so widely read that Thomas More, who was, I'm going to get this wrong, High Chancellor to the King of England, who was Henry VIII at the time, read this report from Amerigo Vespucci, whose first name, by the way, is where we get the name of the Americas. It's named after him. I think just because of he wrote his name on a map or something, and that's how that got carried through. So Thomas More was totally intrigued by this idea of a group of Epicureans living in the New World. So he wrote a book called Utopia, which he, in his own mind, was heavily based on Epicurean philosophy and the idea that there's no monarch. This is a democracy or a republic. People are coming together to make their own rules. You can believe in any religion you want. There's no national church, or there's so you got the separation of church and state involved there. But he does say there's two things that you cannot believe in Utopia. You are not allowed to believe that the soul dies with the body, and you are not allowed to believe that there is no reward or punishment after death. Those are the two prohibitions. You can believe in any religion you want. There's maximal religious freedom with those two exceptions. You can't believe that the soul dies with the body. You can't believe that there's no God and that there's no reward or punishment after death. And the reason he said that in Utopia you're not allowed to believe those two things is because they make contracts impossible. If somebody can't be convinced that they will be rewarded or punished beyond the grave, that there's no incentive for them to keep or hold a contract or a promise they've made in this lifetime. So from Thomas More's position, Epicurean philosophy, which was kind of the inspiration for his whole Utopia book to begin with, actually makes it impossible to live in a society based on the social contract, or based on the word we've been using as compact, an agreement between people. Because somebody who doesn't believe in God, somebody who doesn't believe in heaven and hell, cannot be made to keep a promise to stick to the compact.
That is fascinating to me. I have never read Thomas More's Utopia. It's one of those books you hear about your whole life, but I had no idea about those details, Joshua. Martin, are you familiar with that work at all?
No, I'm not familiar with that one. But I wanted to get this one information right on how this America got wrongly the name America. And it was not Amerigo himself. It was a European cartographer who didn't know of Columbus arriving there before him and thought it was Amerigo. And then that cartographer issued that map. And later on, other people who knew about this pointed this out to him. And he tried to correct it, but already the name was given and it was so already enshrined in the public mind, it could no more be changed back.
Very interesting.
Thank you for that, Martin. Certainly Columbus has not been shortchanged, because his name is all over everything over here as well. The District of Columbia, Columbus, Ohio, the Columbia River, all that.
That's a fascinating detail about the map there. So thanks for adding that in, like Joshua said. I don't think we're nearly ready to come out of the rabbit hole that Joshua has just introduced with Thomas More's Utopia, though. So I want to stick with that for a few more minutes anyway. I know utopia is a word that has such a negative connotation, at least for a certain segment of us today, because it's supposed to be impractical and idealistic, platonic type of a waste of time to even talk about it. And I think that's the idea that I got in my mind about that book. And I never read it as a result. But what you're saying is something that really deserves significant thought and consideration if that's what the book is about. And if that's the reason, I had no idea about him in the Utopia banning those two positions or why you would ban them. It just raises so many comments that you could make about, certainly so many people think that the only reason that civilization exists is because of religion and that you're going to be punished by God if you're unjust. You could go off on a whole long tangent. That's something that's specifically discussed in the inscription of Diogenes of Oinoander, where he says that it's ridiculous that people don't refrain from crime because they're scared of the gods of the Greeks, and much less are they going to refrain from crime if they're concerned about the gods of Socrates or Plato, because they don't refrain from crime, even though those gods are out there supposedly every day threatening people. And so the issue of whether justice requires a belief in punishment after death is something that is in the Epicurean text already. But I had no clue that he would try to link that to a contract rule and say that you have to have those in order to enforce contract. Is it that specific, Joshua, or is it just a more general, you must believe in God or else there's no morality without God punishing evil people? Is it as specific as to actually talk about contracts?
It is, yeah. I can't, if there's two words, I can't remember if it's promises and contracts or something like that, but he really does nail down. This is actually an enduring legacy, of course, in the United States, where swearing in on a Bible has become this huge session. And if you don't add the word "so help me God," if you don't add the word
God
at the end of the oath, you can't be trusted. We can't trust you to keep your word if you don't swear in on a Bible or say "so help me God." And then there's all this creep that happens where you get like, oh, now you're not wearing. You've done that and you've said the words, but now you're not wearing a flag lapel pin, so I can't trust you for that reason. So this. The bar just gets higher and higher as time goes along. You did mention the impracticality of a utopia, and actually the word utopia, if my memory serves, is a play on words between the Latin and the Greek, because in Greek, if you preface something with you, like eudaimonia, for example, EU, it means good, like euphoria, right? But
Yes.
in Latin, you is used to negate something. Or to say, so for example, utopia in Greek would mean good place, but in Latin would mean no place. Typically in English, if you're going to, a lot of the words that survive where we use the U prefix, we add an N, like unnatural. You add that consonant again before the word. But really what it means is unnatural. It's the negation of natural. So utopia is the negation of a place. There's no place where this could work, in Thomas More's opinion. There's no place in which people can be so liberal-minded and so relaxed that, for example, before you got married to someone, there was a rule where you both had to see each other naked. That's in the book. and you don't get married until you both see each other naked and agree to it, and then you can get married. So there's a lot of examples of that where utopia, there's a lot more freedom there than there was in Europe at the time, but you still couldn't go all the way. You still could not claim that the soul died with the body, or that there was no reward or punishment after death, or that there was no God. You had to believe in those things.
I'm going to have to read that book at some point then.
So where does that leave us now?
It leaves us at the moment with two more points that I want to make before we even begin to move to the next paragraph or whatever. This issue that we've been discussing, the contract aspect of it, there is an article out there that I'll add to the episode notes about the contractarian basis of Epicurean justice. And I think I generally am fairly critical of that article, and I can't even remember the details of it now to talk about it with more specificity. But I do think that the issue that has always troubled me, and I think has to be dealt with among people who just simply say that, well, Epicurus endorsed the social contract, and Epicurean philosophy endorses a contractual basis of society, and think that that answers the question. I don't think that answers the question at all, because when you read Epicurus's principal doctrines, it's very clear, to me at least, that where the contract is there, you can get out of the contract as soon as it becomes disadvantageous to you to continue to follow it. So anybody who is wanting to focus on a contractual basis for justice in Epicurean philosophy has to wrestle with the question of how do you deal with breaking of a contract? because in, I think, normal terms of us today, when we think about a contractual basis, we presume that breaking the contract is unjust. It does not appear to me that in general breaking a contract amounts to injustice. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't, but that's a deep subject, I think, that requires a lot of thought, I think, to really think about the implications of it. I guess to some extent what it amounts to in my mind is that just as there's no God and there's no supernatural nature out there that has a list of things that are just and unjust, God hasn't created an absolute justice. And neither can we, by our contracts, create an absolute justice. We don't have the ability to write something down and sign it with someone else and thereby create a law for all times that will govern us no matter the circumstance. We can't do that ourselves any more than a God could, because it's just not the nature of the way things work, that there's an absolute moment in time that is always going to constitute justice or injustice. And that's such a deep subject that I don't have the ability to go much further with that right now. But I don't want to leave that subject without, I think, Joshua, especially in response to what we've been wrestling with in this episode today, justice is such a gut level emotional topic that some people who listen to a discussion like this are going to say, well, okay, you're saying that there's no absolute justice, and therefore these ideas that I believe in with such passion, you're saying are just arbitrary and I should just forget them. Is that what you're saying? And to me, the answer is no, that's not what we're saying. We're not saying that your deeply held, passionate sense of what's just and unjust is irrelevant. We're not saying that it's something you should forget. I think what we're saying is that if you feel strongly that something is unjust, then you should go out and do everything you can to promote that justice, to vindicate that justice, because you have to deal with your feeling there. But the point is, the Epicurean justice system works because, as Epicurus continues to talk about in his doctrines and as what we're reading in Torquatus, we know that if we commit injustice towards other people, that other people are going to punish us. We know that there's going to be retribution against us if we take advantage of someone else, if we oppress someone else, if we harm someone else. We're not looking to God to punish us for it. We don't think that Plato and his absolute forms are going to just zap us from heaven. But what we do know is that in society, people are going to react negatively to us if we are oppressive towards other people. And so the way the system works, as Epicurus understands it, is that people respond against injustice. They respond against oppression. And that means that people who are oppressed need to stand up for themselves, need to make sure that when they are harmed, that some consequence happens as a result of that. So where I'm going, I think, in general, is that we're not saying that you should just simply walk away from your passionate attachment to your sense of justice. We're just saying that if you feel that strongly about it, and if you think something needs to be done about something, then it's up to you or the people working with you to do that, because there's no God who's going to take care of it for you.
Which turns out to be a good thing, right? Because I kind of get what you're saying here, which is that, there's no absolute sense of justice and people can change their minds at any time, so I should just let it all. I know this isn't your position, but this is the one you've described, and I should just let it go, right?
Right.
But because there's no absolute sense of justice, that gives you a space in which you can pursue what you think is your version of justice. If we were all stuck in this hellscape, living under the rules that were established by a primitive deity in Judea 3,000 years ago, there'd be no room for us to even talk about justice. It's you follow the rules and that's it, period. So the understanding that there's no absolute sense of justice, that actually gives you space to maneuver. That gives you space to stand up to oppression, right? Because if justice is absolute, then you just take your lumps and live your life as an outcast or as a peasant or whatever forever. That's your lot. You'll never get anything better than that. That's what you're stuck with. So because justice is not absolute, we're not stuck with any particular arbitrary set of rules here, right? We can always put our energy and our thought into making things better, into making things more advantageous for us and for our fellow citizens.
That is exactly what I'm saying, Joshua. That is exactly what I think is the conclusion that comes from these observations of Epicurus. That everything that's been handed to us when we were born as right and wrong, as a law, as some kind of alleged absolute form of justice, is nothing more than what people who were alive before we were decided, however they came up with it, to be what they wanted to enforce as the law. And that by changing that, we're not sentencing ourselves to an eternity in hell, because God did not establish these laws. There is and I will put this in the show notes as well, there is a passage from Cicero's Republic that I learned in law school that I can't quote it exactly, but Cicero says that true law is right reason in accordance with nature. It's the same everywhere, in Athens and Rome, at all times and all places. And you can't run from it because it's enforced by God. Now, that's a paraphrase of it, but I think that's exactly the opposite of what Epicurus is saying here. There is no God. There is no absolute enforcement mechanism that nature is going to force people within it, and that these rules that we follow are conventions that we've come up with, that humans have come up with in the past, according to their best sense of the best way for them to live. And so I'm not necessarily even being critical of that. They've come up with systems that they thought advantageous to themselves at their particular times. But the idea that those are frozen in time, the idea that there's a absolute tablet that all of those laws must be continued to be enforced in exactly the same way forever and ever, amen, it's just totally bogus, absolutely without foundation. And I think that's what Epicurus is pointing out in these passages about justice. And frankly, I think that's what makes Epicurean philosophy so revolutionary in so many ways. And one of the reasons that Epicurean philosophy has been frowned upon for so long by the establishments of all governments and all types of societies, because it holds open the idea that if an ancient system, if a system that's in place is seen by the people at a particular time to be unjust, then they have a right to change it. There's another Jeffersonian phrase, the earth belongs to the living, in a letter he wrote to Madison. But the earth belongs to the living is a phrase to me that just rings of this Epicurean viewpoint. It doesn't belong to a God because a supernatural God doesn't exist, and it doesn't belong to our ancestors because they're not with us anymore. It belongs to the living.
Yeah, let me give another historical example here because I'm just full of these today. So Montaigne was a great reader of Lucretius, right? He absolutely loved Lucretius. He quoted him a whole bunch of times throughout all his works. I wouldn't call Montaigne an Epicurean necessarily, but he was heavily influenced. There was a case that came up while Montaigne was active in the legal and political sphere in the part of France where he lived, where one or two people were accused of murder, I think it was. Montaigne was heavily in favor of reforming the law, right? So that's kind of the background of why he's talking about this. And what ends up happening is it was eventually proven that these two people were innocent and that they didn't do it, right? What I can't remember is if they found the person who did or if that was inconclusive. But the opinion of what you might call the justice system was that we have to execute these two anyway, even though we know they're innocent, or that's going to set a bad precedent and people are just going to start appealing our decisions all the time, right? People are going to get the idea that we're not an absolute standard of justice, right? Unless we have to kill these two to sort of assert ourselves as the authority to decide the law. Montaigne was heavily against this. I think this was I think part of the reason he retired to his chateau with his books, was he was so fed up with politics and the law and all this. But yeah, this is a huge problem where you've got an authority who decides that they need to actually kill somebody who they know to be innocent just in order to protect their own stature as the final arbiter of what is justice.
Yeah, that's something that happens a lot, it seems to me. at all levels of government, down to your local police officer or local magistrate. People think that you have to have respect for the law. Well, another phrase from American history, we have a government of law and not of men. That's a line that has always been considered to be almost a holy concept in the United States, but I'm not so sure that it should be accepted without a lot of subtle reasoning. I've totally lost track of time and how far we've gone. I think we probably are at the point we need to wrap up for today. And we haven't even really gotten through line 50, but we can come back and continue to deal with this topic as long as we need to. And we should, because it's something that many people are interested in and should be interested in. So, Martin, again.
Yeah, I have two things to notice. So one thing is, of course, if conditions have changed, we cannot just break the contract on a whim or just break the law. We need to change it justly. And that means we change the law in due process and create a new law. Or if it was a private contract, that we make a contract to dissolve the old contract and to make and then replace the old contract with that one, so that it's agreed upon.
I would say all of what you just said is very easily said, but maybe not so easily done. But go ahead.
In case, unfortunately, I divorced this year, and it was based on Thailand's law, and we essentially made a contract to dissolve our marriage contract. And we did this in mutual agreement, which made this whole process easy. We didn't even have to go to court. And I think in this way, it is a good amicable solution. And similarly, you can also mutually agree to dissolve a contract in German law. I mean, it will not apply necessarily to a marriage. There's a law, I think in Germany, you always need to go to a court. But other private contracts, you can change if both sides agree to it according to those terms, so that there is no need to ask a judge to give someone compensation or whatever if both agree already on how to dissolve the contract. Yeah. So if this one is then settled, then the other thing I wanted to mention, just when this example of Montaigne was given with that case, there was a very weird case in Germany where there's also a gap in the law which prevented an unjust sentence could be reversed. Because the way the law provides for this is if there's new evidence. But the problem was the judge didn't really pay close attention and wrongly assessed the evidence and made the wrong decision based on that accurate evidence. No? So this one, there was no way to correct this according to German law.
And so how do you evaluate that?
Yeah, and this one was clearly then, so those who were unjustly sentenced were clearly harmed. No? So this was greatly unjust, and it's really a gap in German law. No? So this is something, I don't know whether after this case came up, whether this gap in the law has been changed, but this is the occurrence of a case like this would, in my view, make it mandatory to change the law to cover this possibility. No?
But what about the people who were involved before the law was changed?
I mean, in this case, it was a criminal case. And in that case, there is no one really harmed other than those who were unjustly sentenced. So by just changing this one, you can then still stop the punishment of those unjustly punished people and give them compensation.
Well, one reaction I have to all of your examples there is that what you've been talking about are examples of how we are humans and we do things as best we can, but we're going to fall short at times, no matter almost what system we have, and that the system may grind over people in ways that if the system is just applied mechanically, we're going to conclude to be unjust. Whether that should be allowed to happen, whether it does happen, those are different questions. I think Epicurus is really just dealing with the philosophical question of, in those situations that you're talking about, whether judges made an incorrect decision. There's justice under the law, and then there's justice in a deeper sense. And the result that system has created in that situation you're talking about is an unjust result. It may have followed the procedure properly according to the law as it existed. And from that position, you can say, well, this is the system of justice. Due process. He received the due process of law. But that doesn't mean that just because he's received the due process of the system, that the result is something that we would all agree to be justice. There's so many deep observations you could make about all these questions, but obviously you have to have some kind of a system. And obviously having a system in place is generally to the advantage of everyone who's involved. One way that's addressed, I should have mentioned this earlier, in the American system would be we have courts of law and we have courts of equity. And then the equity courts, the judges are specifically charged with all of these different equitable maxims, they call them, of what you might consider to be just common sense ideas of justice. But you're not in a court of equity really held to the law. Everything is just thrown up, and the person who makes the decision just comes to a rough sense of justice, regardless of what the actual law might be. So, gosh, again, we could talk forever about these subjects. Joshua.
Well, I'm kind of here flipping through the the reading for today, trying to figure out if there's anything in particular we should pull out and talk about.
Well, we won't even try to consider today to be a full review of 50 through 54. Again, I've lost track of time to know exactly where we are right now, but I don't think we can consider today to be much more than just 50. We'll come back next week and start with 51 through 54 and get as far as we can, and then stay with the topic as long as we need to.
Right. We've discussed it a little bit, but then there's this question of security that comes in, doesn't it? Because in the Principal Doctrines, he talks about this quite a lot, and in the Vatican Sayings, security from other men, and somehow he balances this with justice and injustice.
Oh, yeah.
Injustice only affects you insofar as you fail to secure yourself against it.
Thank you for making that point, because I made sure to add in the list of Principal Doctrines the very first one that probably applies here, Principal Doctrine 6, which is a very high one on the list. It's kind of difficult to understand exactly how the translations come across, but, quote, whatever you can provide yourself with to secure protection from men is a natural good. And that one rings of some kind of endorsement of self-defense or self-protection as something that is so important that it's included within the top 10 doctrines that it would seem clear to me Epicurus is putting out there as a principle to be one of the most basic aspects of his philosophy, is that you've got to protect yourself from other men. That's obviously a sweeping thought, depending on how you apply it.
Right.
So the security that you're talking about goes right along with peace and tranquility that we talk about so much. You must have security from other men, just like you need security from tornadoes and hurricanes.
That's exactly where I was going with this, because in DeWitt, he describes these two words, which he said kind of became a watchword among Epicureans, peace and safety. Mm-hmm. And so I think both of them heavily apply in this case. So, right. So the question, I guess part of the question here is whether you're living in an unjust, just society from your point of view, how do you secure peace and safety for yourself and for your friends? That becomes a whole separate question. There's the question of what is justice, and then there's a question of how should a person with no power, with no ability to change the law, how should a person go about arming themselves to deal with people around them who might support laws that are unjust from their point of view?
And there's absolutely no doubt that that's an extremely thorny question. It doesn't have an answer that's going to suit everybody. People are going to get violently mad at each other depending on the answer that they give. It's going to be a Harper's Ferry, John Brown type of a litmus test almost of one person can look at the same facts and just be outraged by it, and the other one can look at that fact and be just thrilled by it. But from a philosophical point of view, I think what Epicurus is telling us is that that's just the way things are. And there's no God. There's no absolute realm of forms, like Plato suggested, that can answer that question for us. We have to answer the question, and we can decide to live in a system like the United States and have common law and there's no inherent superiority of that system over a European system, or however you would like to call it, Napoleonic or continental or Roman, where you have entirely different sets of structures. It's not the structures that are inherently good or bad. It's the actual result of them. for the people involved at the particular time and place that determines whether something is just or unjust, I think is what Epicurus is suggesting to us. And I'm not sure that that result just doesn't make everybody unhappy with Epicurus, because everybody wants to think that Epicurus has endorsed their particular system, and that Epicurus, if he were alive today, would be a member of their particular political party or their particular segment of society. And he would be a part of something, because he'd be a living human being who has to live in a particular context. He would take positions, but his philosophy is deeper than that and wider than that. And just, I think what it points out is whatever position you end up on has derived from this basic understanding of the way the world works. And that's what he's trying to talk about in his philosophy, is the way the world works.
Yeah, and that's something we see on the forum, isn't it? People come in and they'll get into Epicurean philosophy a little bit, and then they'll say something like, oh, this really reminds me of objectivism. Or
yes.
Yeah. So you do see this, where it's sort of the idea that Epicurus is attempting to justify one of these totally modern political or economic or philosophical movements that weren't even around when he was alive. So that's an interesting point as well.
Yeah, I definitely think that each of us can and should take these principles and apply them in our individual circumstances. And that's going to end up leading us to become involved in our communities and take particular positions that are going to end up looking and are going to end up being political in a sense. But I think that you're just short-circuiting the whole process if you don't start out by thinking about the way the world operates, a correct philosophy, which I think what Epicurus was setting forth there. If you at least start with the foundation that Epicurus is presenting, then I think you end up with a much more intelligent result, no matter what your circumstances are. Boy, this has been a very rambling episode, but I hope that it has been of benefit to talk through it like we have, and we'll continue to talk through it further. Anyone else have anything further for today?
No. Oh, not particularly. Yeah, there's a whole lot going on here. We've raised about 20 different angles of attack that we could use to talk about this. You could spend a lifetime talking about just this, but we don't have a lifetime to talk about just this. We'll come back next week and talk a little bit more about it. But these questions, as so many other questions, are going to remain a challenge to us as we go forward. But we're not on the verge of finding resolution, I don't think.
Only in the sense that the resolution that we find is a broader understanding of the way things are and the way things work, and that justice and history and the passions that we feel for the things that we see around us, they have a context in which they have to be viewed.
I guess the way I would put it, Cassius, is once you've understood Epicurus's conception of justice, that there's no absolute morality, there's no absolute eternal law, there's no absolute sense of justice. It's great that you've got that far, but all of your work now is ahead of you, because now you have to decide, okay, justice is a compact that people make for advantageous dealings between themselves, and it's going to change as circumstances change. All your work now is ahead of you. You've got to decide, how are you going to live in a world where there is no absolute justice or morality? Yeah.
Joshua, that is a great place to end the episode today, with that phrase in mind in particular. All your work is still ahead of you. There are so many people who want to take Epicurus and say, once you understand Epicurus, you'll understand the goal of life is tranquility. The goal of life is to go find yourself a cave, find some bread and water, and sit there and do nothing. Because all you want in life is absence of pain. And I think that is just absolute hogwash. When you understand Epicurus, your phrase is what applies. All your work is still ahead of you. You understand Epicurus, and you understand that you don't go sit in the cave. You understand that your one shot in eternity is the 70 or so years that you're going to be alive on this earth. And if you don't go out and use that time, enjoy it, make the most of it, apply the information that Epicurus has shown you, then you've just wasted the only thing you really have, which is your time and your life. You don't sit in the cave. You go out and you make use of the information, and you pursue happiness, pleasure in the best way you know how, with all the vigor that you can invest in it. Okay. We'll go on and on forever if we don't call a halt. So we'll call a halt for today. I'll get this posted as soon as we can, and we invite comments and suggestions and questions that we'll try to incorporate in future episodes as we continue to discuss these issues. But for today, we'll close. So thanks, everybody, and we'll be back soon.
Thanks and bye.
Bye.